there. So baking is something that calms me down, helps my anxiety, but it's also good when there's no bread on the shelves. So I thought, why not do a bread tutorial? My husband suggested it, we're gonna do it. So first of all the credit for this recipe goes to Bonnie O'Hara. Buy this book, it's amazing. I recommend it to everyone who is into baking. It's great, so that's where this recipe comes from. And this is very similar to the bread that I bake at our farm stand. So if you like that, you'll like this. The first thing you're gonna need is a food scale. Baking weighing by weight is really important, and it could make the difference in your recipe if something turns out or doesn't. It could be just that you had the wrong measurement. So already forgotten a bowl, but the first thing we're going to do is get our water in and start activating our yeast. You will need a bowl. So for this recipe, we're going to use 375 grams of room temperature water. Water at room temperature is generally about 76 degrees, but honestly, this recipe is so forgiving that I don't even really take the temperature anymore. I just run it under my finger, and if it feels lukewarm to me, I go with that. Okay, so 375 grams of water in our bowl. The next ingredient in this bread is yeast. So you all probably do not buy this much yeast. You certainly can and store it in your refrigerator. But I don't think yeast is sold out. So you can really get it pretty much anywhere. We're also going to measure this yeast. Many recipes call for an envelope or a packet, but in this we're actually going to measure it out. And so I'm going to grab a spoon here. We're going to measure out, get my scale going here, 8 grams of yeast. So I typically use, when I'm measuring smaller amounts, I use a smaller container. You just kind of get a more accurate reading. This is actually a condiment cup that I use. Hi, buddy. My kids live here too, so now the next step is taking you've got your nice room temperature water. We're gonna sprinkle our yeast over the top of it, and just to kind of get it going, I just imagine you're like getting a nice bubble bath going, and just kind of give it a nice little swish. You should, if your yeast is good. Guys, play nice, please. If your yeast is good and it's ready to go, you should almost immediately kind of smell that bready, yeasty smell that in this case you want. So we're going to let that go for about maybe 5 minutes while we measure our other 2 ingredients. That's another thing I like about this bread is 4 ingredients. That's it. It's very simple, super easy, very forgiving if you've never baked or baked bread before. Hi, Grace.
Watch, Mama.
Sure, I'm actually making a video right now. Look up.
Wow.
Whoa.
Hi, Mama.
Can you let your sister up too, please? You guys can share, huh? All right, so for the dry ingredients, we need, see if I can find a big spoon here.
Big spoon.
We need about 500, no, not about, we need 500 grams of flour. This is AP flour. Well, Mommy's gonna measure. You can dump it in when it's time, okay? The best parts of this recipe with kids is mixing. They can get their hands really in it if your kids like to have wet hands, and also cutting and shaping the dough. What do we usually call this bread, Henry?
Snake bread.
Snake bread, because you stretch it out into nice long loaves. The measuring part for kids who are little might be a little tough. So typically, I've got my scale on, I'm measuring, and typically This takes about one of these containers to be about 500 grams. And the other thing I like about this bread is that none of these, whoops, I'm a little over. None of these ingredients will really go bad. The ingredients are flour, yeast, water, and salt. That's it. And thyme. There we go. Okay, so we have 500 grams of flour. We're going to set that off to the side. We got our flour, Grace.
Oh, I want stirring.
You want to do the stirring? Okay, well, we're going to measure our salt. That's the last ingredient. Now, typically, you don't want your salt and your yeast to touch if you can help it. The salt could inhibit the yeast to work. So right now, I'm going to measure out 10 grams of salt. This is kosher salt. I would recommend using kosher salt in your baking rather than iodized salt. Now, I don't know if you guys can see this. It started to look a little foamy in the water. You can see the yeast is starting to break down. A general rule of thumb is about 5 minutes, but when you start seeing this cloudy water where your yeast no longer is in those little cylindrical shapes, you're ready to go. So, okay, we are going to put our scale away because that's all the measuring you do. It's really not that scary. I promise you can do it. All right, Grace. So we're going to dump in our flour. You want to help? Ready? Dump, 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 dump. All right, can you put the salt right on top, baby? Put that salt right on top. Good job. She dumped. You can help make the snakes though, okay? The other thing I like about this bread is you need no tools other than a scale and some bowls for measuring. You use your hands to mix. You don't need a stand mixer. If you really don't like getting your hands wet, you can certainly use a wooden spoon. Don't pull your sister's hair, please. So right now you're gonna mix. The best way that I like to do it is to kind of put my hand, it's kind of like a folding. I put my hand under into that lukewarm water. And I just start to incorporate my flour in. It looks like a big old mess right now. I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm sorry. There, that's much better. Sorry about that. So when you're making this bread, you're kind of using a pushing motion. So I'm pushing the dough down. Well, I want that off for a minute, baby. But do you see how it's already starting to kind of come together? It's a little bit less slack. And I'm using my little dough ball here. I know, honey. I'm using my dough ball to get all of the excess flour around the bowl. So we have a nice little bowl here. Okay, so now an important step. Okay, you can drink that, sweetie. It's mommy's leftovers. All right, so we've got our nice ball here. Now, the next step is for the dough to hydrate. So what we want is the water to penetrate the flour and really start to hydrate those grains. So this is about 20 minutes, and we'll check back in 20. All right. Grace, what's wrong?
I made brother fall down.
You made brother fall down?
Yeah.
Trials and tribulations, childhood. All right, so now this really technically is not a kneaded bread. We're going to do a little bit of gluten development, a little bit of shaping before we let this dough have its first rise. So get yourself either a clean workspace. I like to use a cutting board. It's just kind of easy for cleanup because I have this tiny little counter to work with. So you're going to take some flour. Don't be afraid to use flour on this. It's better to err on a little bit extra rather than
I need one spoon.
Than not. So, all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to gently get this dough out onto the flour.
And you want some taste.
You want some to taste?
Yeah.
Well, lucky for you, girl. This is a 4-ingredient easy bread. So here you go. All right. So again, I'm going to get some flour. I've got some flour in my hands. Now, what we're doing here is we're going to be making what I like to call, or in what Bonnie O'Hare calls in her book, an envelope fold, I think. I can't remember. But, so, what she means by that is go up here to the top, and you're going to take the top, and you're just going to fold it down to the middle and gently press, okay? And it does slightly resemble the top of an envelope. You've got a nice little shape here that you folded down. So you're going to do that a few times. I like to turn my dough as I'm doing it. And as you go, again, don't be afraid to use flour. As you go, you're going to notice that it's going to start to tighten. You like it?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on, baby. You're going to notice that your dough is going to get some elasticity and it's going to really start to tighten. So I'm continuing to do it here. There's really no right number of times. You just really don't want to do it so much that your dough is kind of like ripping or seems to be too tight. I'm sorry, that's kind of big, but when you make this 100 times, some of it's just in your brain and it's hard to get out. So I'm going to hold this little dough baby up and show you guys what it looks like. But it is very smooth. It's nice and tight. It's a nice tight little ball. Yeah. So the other great thing about this recipe, it's all done in one bowl. So you can use the same bowl during the whole time. You want some dough? Here, I will get you some dough. This is your last piece, okay? Apparently it's pretty good. So now the next thing you want to do is let your dough rise. And so your yeast is really going to start activating and the gluten is going to keep developing as it rises. So what I'm doing right now is I'm grabbing a clean kitchen towel. And I'm going to put it over my bowl and I'm going to put it in a warm place. So I'm putting it on top of my stove right now. And now this is going to set for an hour and a half. It's really important to time it out. I know that earlier I said one of the ingredients was thyme, and I was not talking about the spice. I was talking about literally just thyme. Underproofed or overproofed dough will not bake correctly, and so it is really important that you make sure that you have the time to make this. But hey, you know, if you're working from home, just take a few minutes and start your dough and then go get some emails done. So we're gonna let this rise for an hour and a half. Remember how kind of small and tight that little ball was? It's gonna expand. There's gonna be a lot of bubbles and air pockets inside. And then we'll move on to the next steps. Okay, so it's been an hour and a half. We're back. We're gonna bake the bread on just a regular sheet pan. And then I guess I should have included this in ingredients, but you need a neutral oil. You don't want to use something that has a really strong taste. Olive oil is fine. Canola oil, vegetable oil, it's all right. It doesn't really make a huge difference. So I'm going to give it a nice little coating here. Now, earlier we used flour on our hands so the dough wouldn't stick, and now we're actually going to use this oil. So freshly washed hands, which everyone hopefully is washing their hands a lot right now. So I'm just going to kind of give this a spread, make sure it's even. So now I've got some oil on my hands so my dough won't stick. So if you remember before this rise, the dough was in a tight, really taut ball. So hopefully, big reveal, we have lots of rise. We have a beautiful big dough ball. So it's very marshmallowy. What you really want is you want to be able to stick your finger in and leave it a nice little indent there. I don't know if you can see that. So we are just going to gently scrape our dough out. Now don't be upset if you feel like you're destroying all these beautiful bubbles, because it's going to have one more proof after this. So it is all right. So we've got our kind of blobby blob. I'm actually going to just drizzle a little bit of oil on top. I'm going to just start stretching it. So this is why my son calls it snake bread. At this point, it's very forgiving. It's actually kind of fun. Feels like slime or something that the kids make these days. So I'm going to put it. Now this is a bench scraper. It has a blunt edge. This is not sharp. You can certainly use a knife. You could use a butter knife. You could use anything you want to cut this dough. The thing is to remember that because it has oil on it, it's not going to stick or adhere back to itself very well. So once you cut it, it's kind of cut. Now, for my farm stand, I usually cut this into 4 different loaves, and they make these really lovely kind of long baguette-like shapes. But you can also cut this into 2 loaves, and it makes a little bit of a larger loaf, and it's kind of better for sandwiches. It just depends what you want to use it for. So I'm going to cut it lengthwise. I'm going to cut it, I want to work with the way the dough already is, and I did that little bit of stretching earlier. So.
I want some dough.
You want some dough? Here, I'll cut you some. Here you go, baby. It's got some oil on it. Okay, so now we have kind of dough shapes, mildly dough shaped. So, but I'm just gonna kind of, I like to let gravity kind of do the work. So I'm just letting it stretch out a bit. There we go, easy peasy. There's one loaf. You can see the difference between the two. All I did was pick it up on the 2 ends, and I kind of just moved it in my hands. And again, just let gravity kind of do the work on that middle section, just elongating the dough. I'm not really pulling even, I'm just letting the sheer weight of the dough stretch it out.
I want some dough.
You want some dough? I just gave you some dough.
Some more.
And you can kind of pat it down, smooth it out a little bit. All right, so the last step here, I'm gonna take get some of this oil off my hands. The last step now, while it has its lapse proof, just so I don't cover it, but just so it stays hydrated on the top. You just had a piece of dough, honey.
I need some.
I'm gonna just do one little drizzle on top here. Okay, so now this needs to sit for 30 more minutes to have that last rise. We just manipulated the dough, and so we kind of got some of it out. I don't know if you can see, there are still some bubbles in here. Whoop, they're kind of sliding. So this will be the shape. They're gonna puff up a little bit, but this is gonna be the shape of our loaves. So I am going to just set these aside here. I'm gonna turn my oven on to 475. Now that might seem extreme, but you really do need a hot oven. So I'm actually gonna let it be on. Don't you touch that dough, ma'am. Don't you steal my dough. So I'm gonna let it preheat for the entire half an hour. All right, so we'll see you in half an hour. Okay, so they have been sitting for about a half an hour. They have puffed up considerably. So right now is the time to put anything on top of your bread that you want to. You certainly don't have to, but you can kind of spice it up a little. So I'm gonna leave one plain, and I'm gonna put this everything bagel seasoning on the other. What do you think, Henry?
That sounds good.
Sounds good. I've done roasted garlic before. You can even do like cinnamon sugar. So now these are going to cook for about 20 to 25 minutes. You want it to turn a nice golden brown. And then you'll need to let it sit for a minimum of maybe 10 to 20 minutes because you want that crumb inside, all those little bubble and craggly bits on the inside to form. If you cut it the minute it gets out of the oven, it's all going to smush together and you're going to lose that shape. So happy baking. Wash your hands. Stay inside.